Kids these days don't know how good they've got it. This is a popular American sentiment heard from folks of past generations, dating back centuries in the history of the United States. And for the most part, it rings true. Life for any human being on Earth, whether it's a child, fully grown adult, or the elderly, is drastically easier now than it ever was before. Of course, every era of human existence has its conditions that affect the overall quality of life. One such detail is the land in which someone resides, and depending on the period of history they find themselves in, could make all the difference in their ultimate survival and longevity. The Western frontier is one such place, harboring a completely different way of life in the 19th century, both for the Native Americans already populating the plain, as well as the white settlers migrating westward in search of a new life. To gain a better understanding of how exactly children lived during the most fascinating era in American history, here's a deeper inspection into exactly how one would survive the Wild West as nothing more than a youngling. Before one could even take their first step in attempting to survive life in the Old West, they'd first and foremost need to survive childbirth and infancy. While babies obviously have no control over their livelihood and circumstances of which they're born into, the reality of the times dictated an incredibly rough upbringing for infants in the days, weeks, and months after birth. First and foremost, there were no hospitals or state-of-the-art facilities dotting the Western landscapes. The frontier was an underdeveloped, untamed territory. Most towns consisted of a few structures, such as a general store, post office, and a saloon or hotel if it had been established long enough. What towns didn't have were doctors' offices, and oftentimes no doctor to speak of in the first place. Medical professionals were hard to come by, especially in the early days of westward expansion. It could take days, if not months, for a doctor to be hailed and complete a journey to an isolated town or homestead. Before the heyday of the Pony Express, with the expansion of the railway, or the installation of a telegram service, these estimates were even longer. Thus, pregnant women were left to fend for themselves. On occasion, an expecting mother would know someone who either had experience birthing themselves or experience aiding other mothers in delivery. These self-labeled midwives would then join the expecting mother on their homestead and do just about anything and everything they could to ensure the safety of not just the woman, but their child as well. If the baby was relatively healthy, positioned correctly in the mother's womb, and required no special surgeries or procedures upon birth, its survival chances were already higher than most. If the baby was born upside down, turned sideways, or in an otherwise topsy-turvy position, its fate was already sealed, as horrific as that is to hear. Once a healthy babe was born, though, the family wasn't out of the woods quite yet. Many locales across the frontier were defined by unsanitary birthing conditions, especially if delivery came on the trail or in a wagon party. The Oregon Trail and others were rife with limited water resources that harbored disease and bacteria. Without clean water came a host of illnesses and conditions that babies were prone to contract. Considering their incredibly fragile immune systems, they didn't have a fighting chance. Prior to the widespread decimation of Native American tribes due to infectious disease, indigenous women had it a little easier in terms of labor and delivery. Many tribes considered pregnancy and childbirth a sacred process, and depending on the community, everyone in a camp would come together to be a part of the process. Teepees or other handmade structures, called women lodges, were erected and housed both menstruating women as well as expecting mothers. When it was time for labor, a medicine woman and or a collection of fellow female members would join the mother in the lodge. Together, they would conduct a birthing ceremony filled with chants and prayers that both mother and child would remain healthy throughout the process. The baby would be born unto a trough, dug into the ground of the lodge, and upon birth would be swaddled in woven cloth. In Plains tribes, specifically the Lakota Sioux, the newborn's umbilical cord would be cut and placed in a pouch near their homemade crib. A decoy pouch would also be used to fool evil spirits. When the baby was old enough to walk and wear clothing, the real pouch would be transferred to their garments as special protection against further darkness. Regardless of whether or not you ascribe to their superstitions or spirituality, at least something was attempted to safeguard the children, because as you're about to find out, it wasn't always easy being a kid on the frontier. The miracle of a successful childbirth was temporary, after all. Unlike the modern American youth movement, childhood was not all fun and games. In fact, as soon as a toddler reached an age in which they could walk straight and steady, they were put into work by the heads of the homestead. These chores weren't simply making one's bed, or setting the table, or cleaning up the day's mess. Kids of the frontier were faced with tasks that the children of today would find grueling and worthy of complaints. Frontier younglings dared not test their parents' patience with grumbling, however, and rarely voiced their displeasure. Instead, they got right to work the second the sun rose and the rooster crowed. Popular farmstead chores for kids, including milking the dairy cows and other producing livestock, tending to overgrowth in the garden, and collecting kindling for the fireplace. For children nearing adolescence, they might be tasked with even tougher work, such as roping young cattle, aiding in construction efforts, and taking on larger roles with the actual farming. Oftentimes, children were expected to step up even more when the father was away. Wartime saw many men leave their homesteads to fight in battles, whether it be the American Civil War, the Mexican-American War, or a host of smaller conflicts in between. When duty called for these men, it was all hands on deck, women and children alike. Gender roles went by the wayside, as young girls were expected to carry out tasks regardless if the men did it or not. Young boys might do the same. If their mother was to take on the more laborious tasks in the field or with the livestock, they might be required to do the laundry, prepare the meals, and look after infants if their siblings weren't of age. It should be noted, life as a kid in the Old West wasn't all work and no play. Children were granted time to run wild with their imagination and play, especially if a family had multiple siblings. However, playtime often included makeshift toys, kids using odds and ends or random objects strewn about the homestead to have fun. Toys, at least in the modern interpretation of the word, were usually expensive and hard to come by. Instead of flashy instruments with bright colors or well-stitched dolls, kids found the fun in old silverware, worn wheels, straw figures, and tattered bedsheets to build forts. That is, if they weren't exhausted from an entire day's worth of labor and arguments. Infighting is a staple of any family, no matter if it's on a frontier farmstead or indigenous campsite, or in a cozy parlor in 2023 New York City. And for many children, it was a fixture for long trips from here to there, with frontier life creating a nomadic lifestyle everywhere one looked. Even after families completed their arduous trek across the Oregon Trail or similar caravan routes, there were no guarantees that the first homestead would be their last. Wells and other water resources might not be as deep as one thought, and without water, a homestead couldn't survive. Another hindrance to planting roots was the land itself. A crop might not last after 1 or 2 seasons, forcing farms to find fertile soil elsewhere. If hostiles moved into an area, this might also convince a family to up and leave. The Great Plains is also notorious for its weather and stormy seasons. If a twister or high winds swept through a homestead, the children might be faced with yet another arduous move to a safer and more stable region. These frequent and arduous expeditions were not for the faint of heart either, and placed a huge mental burden on the children who had no choice but to tag along. Of course, there were a portion of kids who looked forward to life assail, finding adventure in the unexpected. Others weren't as optimistic though, and were ridden with anxiety. It's hard to understand or quantify viewing their experiences through a modern lens. But imagine, you're a 7-year-old boy or girl who is forced to reckon with their own mortality, coming face to face with the reality that the untamed environment you're finding passage through might just be the thing to jump out of the dark and inflict pain on your family. Okay, children might not have been thinking that deeply, but kids are smarter than we often give them credit for. Plus, for all the good a child's imagination does for them, it also comes with the bad. Imagine an only child traveling through the barren plain, their only company a mule or dairy cow. Their parents walk solemnly beside them as a thunderstorm brews overhead. In the distance, the chants of a Lakota Sioux band can be heard. Are they friendly? Are they foes? If our wagon wheels break down, if our progress is halted, will anyone help us? Has God forsaken us? Nomadic lifestyles were even more popular amongst Native Americans, especially Plains tribes like the Cheyenne, Sioux, and Osage nations. Tribal moves were based on the readiness of game, namely buffalo, as well as the ability to harvest crops. Intertribal relationships were also vital to indigenous life, and if one band moved, other bands reliant on their trade and resources might move too. Tribes were also known to have moved as a result of being pushed out by rivals, as ancestral lands were constantly shifting between the countless nations that called the frontier home for generations. Native children, much like their white counterparts, had similar duties and responsibilities. They'd be tasked with aiding the tribe at large in their moves. Older boys would also be granted an opportunity to go on vision quests as they entered adulthood and were expected to aid in buffalo hunts and war parties. For the most part, a formal education wasn't the way of indigenous culture like it was for pioneer children. But even then, the Old West wasn't exactly a haven for academia either. Schoolhouses on the frontier were more so community-based projects, with members of a town or small settlement coming together to not only build the one-room structures, but maintain their integrity too. In cooler climates away from the American Southwest, winters proved too harsh for a schoolhouse to exist without a wood-burning stove. If students were too cold to learn, the entire infrastructure was at risk of being a total waste. In many frontier towns, children were accustomed to having the same school teacher for most of their education. Schoolmarms, as they were called, were usually assigned multiple grades at a time, needing to wield lessons across all subjects. Whether it be arithmetic, literature, or language, one size must fit all. The same mindset wasn't available for all students, however. Even as the frontier developed and persons of color assimilated into U.S. society, non-white children weren't granted the same educational opportunities. Native American children were sent to special boarding schools on the government-mandated reservations, where they were forced to forego their culture and embrace Christian norms. Further towards the Pacific coast, children of Chinese immigrants faced similar difficulties. Instead of going uneducated, however, many immigrant communities came together to foster their own academic systems, sending children to schools built and paid for by the residents themselves. And of course, prior to segregation laws, black children who moved west both before and after the Civil War were not allowed to learn alongside white children, depending on the laws of the locale. Larger frontier towns would offer schoolhouses for either white or black students. However, it wasn't rare to see black schoolhouses neglected due to smaller enrollments. Taking all of this into consideration, it's not a stretch to say that the times we live in now are much kinder to our kids than the Wild West ever was. However, you could say that just about any age group. With the passage of time has come advancements in technology, education, and an understanding of acceptance. It's fascinating to look back and marvel at how children could possibly survive such rough and rugged terrain. But then again, they didn't really have a choice. And for what it's worth, their perseverance is what makes the ease of our livelihoods today that much sweeter. Yes, even for the kids, who truly don't know how good they've got it.